All right, get ready to dive deep today, folks, because we're tackling criminal law in the Philippines.
Oh, yeah.
You want to know how the system works, right? Maybe you need it for work, for some research project.
hmm
Or, hey, maybe you just really love a good legal mystery, huh?
It's fascinating stuff.
Well, we've got you covered today. We're going to break down this legal text that lays out the general principles.
Hmm.
And trust me, folks, you'll be surprised by what we find in here.
I think what's so interesting about criminal law in the Philippines is it goes beyond just the convictions and punishments. It digs into the psychology behind the intent, the hows and the whys of the crime. It's less about did they do it and more what made them do it and how responsible are they really?
Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting to me, because you wouldn't believe some of the exemptions from criminal liability that the system uses. Like, imagine this. You could actually commit a crime and still be legally exempt from punishment.
Yeah, one of those exemptions is insanity. Philippine law recognizes that someone who is legally insane at the time of a crime, they might not be fully responsible for their actions. There's a case in 2018, People versus Marana, where they convicted this guy of being a pedophile, but then it was debated whether he could even tell right from wrong. So it really sparked this debate about how responsible someone can be when mental incapacity is part of the picture.
Wow, so even in a case like that, with something so horrific, their state of mind can really change everything. I bet proving insanity in court is like a legal minefield, though, huh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It requires intense psychological evaluations, often sparks these huge legal battles, but
Yeah.
that's what makes it so fascinating. You have to grapple with these big questions about free will and responsibility and what it really means to be guilty.
Yeah, it's like you're peeking behind the curtain of the justice system. You see the human drama playing out. Now, another thing that surprised me was this whole idea of an accident being an exemption. We're not just talking about any fender bender, though. There's this case from 2021, Calera versus Ho Fleet Services Philippines. It really digs into what counts as a true, unforeseen, and injurious occurrence. There's a very specific legal threshold there.
Yeah, think about it this way. You're walking down the street, crowded street, and you bump into someone by accident. They trip and fall, right? Well, that's just a mishap. That's not legally an accident. It has to be unavoidable, something that was impossible to foresee, truly outside of anyone's control.
So it's not just being clumsy or making a mistake. It has to be more like, whoa, I did not see that coming.
Exactly. And then you've got this duo, Irresistible Force and Uncontrollable Fear. These exemptions, they kind of go together, but they have the subtle difference between them.
Okay, so let's untangle this. What's the difference between being forced to do something versus being too afraid not to do something? It seems like both mean you don't have a choice, right?
You're right. They both mean you're being coerced, but the way you're coerced is different. Like, irresistible force is almost like you're a puppet, right? Like, imagine someone robs a bank and forces you to open the vault because they're overpowering you physically. So you're just a tool, essentially.
So there's no wiggle room there. You're literally forced to act against your will.
Right. But now, uncontrollable fear is more about the psychology of it. Like, say you're forced to steal money because someone's threatening your family. The threat is so real, so urgent, that you just feel like you have no choice.
It's like the classic do this or else, but the or else has to be pretty bad to count as uncontrollable fear.
Right. Absolutely. The fear has to be reasonable. Like, a normal person in that situation would also feel that way. And it has to be to prevent some even worse thing from happening. So, like, if someone says they embezzled money because they were afraid of getting a bad performance review, well, that's not going to fly. The threat has to be serious to create that level of fear.
I see, I see. So you're really looking into their minds, these times when maybe their actions don't match what they really wanted. Now, here's a term that jumps out to me: battered woman syndrome. I know it relates to domestic abuse, but what's its role in criminal law?
Oh, it's actually a very powerful concept. Legally, it's changed how domestic violence cases are handled. Imagine a woman trapped in this cycle of abuse, years of physical and mental torture. Well, the law in the Philippines recognizes that this can severely mess with someone's state of mind. Like, she might do things she wouldn't normally do. That's why they have this battered woman syndrome as a defense. It was really solidified in this case, People versus Genosa, back in 2004.
So if a woman, after years of abuse, hurts or even kills her abuser, could she use that as a defense?
Yes, and it's not about condoning violence, it's about seeing the effects of the abuse. The courts realize that in that situation, She might feel totally trapped, like there's no other way out. But, like with any defense, it's not a free pass. There has to be solid evidence.
Right, right. There has to be proof, like records of the abuse or psychological evaluations.
Exactly. The courts need to be absolutely sure that she really suffered from this battered woman syndrome, and that whatever she did was directly because of that trauma.
Man, it makes you think how sometimes the line between victim and offender can get really blurry.
Absolutely. And you know what else is interesting? How the Philippines handles cases with kids who commit crimes. They call them children in conflict with the law, or
Oh, wow.
CICL.
So it's not just like a slap on the wrist for something small. There's a whole system for these situations.
You got it. And it's all about figuring out what led the child to do it in the first place. It focuses on rehabilitation and intervention instead of just punishment. It's about giving them another chance instead of just branding them as a criminal.
I like that approach, yeah. It's more about fixing the problem, not just handing down a sentence.
Yeah.
Like saying, okay, you messed up, but let's help you get back on track.
Exactly. And to figure out the best way to help, they look at something called discernment. Basically, could the child tell right from wrong when they did it?
So, like, a 10-year-old who steals candy is different from a 17-year-old who does something more serious.
Exactly. Discernment is key to figuring out how guilty they are and what the right legal response is. It's not letting kids off the hook, it's making sure things are fair, given how old they are in their development.
Right. The punishment should match how much they understood the situation.
Yeah.
Now, what does this intervention actually involve?
Think of it as support, designed to tackle the things that made the child break the law. Maybe therapy, education programs, family counseling, skills training, anything that helps them cope and make better decisions in the future.
That's so much better than just locking them up and hoping for the best.
Absolutely. The goal is to rehabilitate them and get them back into society.
Okay, before we move on, there's one term I just have to ask about. I saw this word imbecile used when talking about legal exemptions. Now, we don't hear that word much anymore, and it's usually not a good thing.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It's pretty offensive and outdated in normal conversation. But in the law in the Philippines, it has a very specific meaning. It's not meant to be a label or an insult. It's just a way to classify someone who is totally without reason, kind of like how insanity is used elsewhere.
So it's more about their mental capacity to understand their actions, not about calling them a name.
Precisely. It reminds us that legal language often has its own special meanings, different from everyday talk.
Okay, legal jargon lesson learned. Now, what I really find fascinating about Philippine criminal law is it's not just about black and white, guilty or not guilty. It's about all the shades of gray in between. Like, a perfect example is the concept of mitigating and aggravating circumstances. Those factors can really change someone's sentence.
Yeah, that's a great point. These circumstances can make someone less guilty or more guilty, so you get a fuller picture of what happened and who the person really is. It's not just what they did, but why, and what was happening around them at the time.
That's like adding more context to the story, right?
Yeah.
Their motives and the little details that make someone more or less responsible.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so interesting, because some of these factors are surprising.
Okay, spill the beans. What are some of these mitigating circumstances that can actually reduce someone's punishment?
All right, well, let's start with a familiar one. Praeter intentionem. Remember we talked about that earlier. It means they didn't mean to cause so much harm. Like, imagine this heated argument that goes way too far and ends tragically, but no one meant for it to happen. They use a really sad parricide case in the text to show how this works. Even in a tragic case like that, if they can prove that the person didn't intend for the consequences to be so bad, well, it can lighten their sentence.
So even within the same crime, there were different levels of intention, different levels of guilt. It's not just what they did, but their mindset at the time.
Exactly. And that's just one of the many mitigating circumstances. Wait till we get to uncontrollable fear in action, or how cultural values affect this idea of immediate vindication of a grave offense.
Ooh, okay. I'm on the edge of my seat. I can tell this is going to be a wild ride.
You said it. We're just getting started, and believe me, there are tons more twists and turns ahead. Remember those mitigating circumstances we were discussing? The ones that can actually lighten someone's sentence. Well, there's this one. It's called immediate vindication of a grave offense. And it's super interesting in the Philippines because of the culture there.
Okay, immediate vindication. Sounds kind of, I don't know, Shakespearean. Like defending your honor with a duel at sunrise. What's the modern legal version of that?
Well, it's all about understanding how cultural values, and family ties can really affect what people do. Imagine your close family member, someone really hurts them. Now, the person who did it, they act quickly, driven by like these strong emotions and a sense of duty protecting their family. That's immediate vindication.
So it's not that violence is okay. It's more like acknowledging that in some cultures, family is everything. And it can push people to do things that, to outsiders might seem crazy.
Right. It's acknowledging that deep sense of obligation, of needing to protect your own. Doesn't excuse the act, but it helps explain why they did it.
So it's like the law is saying, hey, we're not just individuals making choices. We're part of this whole web of relationships. And those can lead us to do unpredictable things.
Exactly. And it's not just about family. The timing is key, too. The crime has to happen right after the offense, like that raw emotional reaction. It can't be weeks or months later.
So it's got to be in the heat of the moment before you have time to cool off and think straight.
Right. Okay, let's switch gears a bit, talk about another mitigating circumstance. This one really gets into the heart of human emotion. Passion and obfuscation.
Ooh, passion and obfuscation. That sounds kind of romantic, like something at a soap opera.
Yeah.
What kind of situations are we talking about here?
Picture this. You walk in on your spouse, they're cheating on you right there in front of you. In that moment, you're overwhelmed with betrayal, with rage. You just act without thinking. You might do something you'd never do normally. That intense emotional turmoil, feeling like you're drowning in heartbreak and anger, that's passion and obfuscation.
So it's like the legal system is saying, even the most level-headed person can lose it when their emotions are pushed too far.
Exactly. But like with any defense, there are limits. It's not a free pass. The court has to be convinced that the emotional distress was real and that it caused the crime. Has to be the direct link, not just a bad day or something.
So if I rear-end someone because I had a rough day at work, passion and obfuscation probably won't save me, huh?
You got it. There has to be that clear connection between how they felt and what they did. It's recognizing those moments when our emotions just take over, even if the consequences are terrible.
It reminds me of those Shakespearean tragedies,
Oh.
One moment of passion can set off this chain of events that can't be undone.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now let's talk about two mitigating circumstances that often go together. They are voluntary surrender and voluntary confession of guilt.
Okay, so those seem pretty straightforward. Like you mess up, you own up to it, shows you're remorseful, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Imagine someone commits a crime. Then they're just overwhelmed with guilt, and they turn themselves in. That act, surrendering to the authorities, taking responsibility, it says a lot about them. They're not trying to run away, they're facing the consequences.
And confessing is like saying, I know I did wrong and I want to make things right.
Right. A voluntary confession shows they're sincere. They want to fix things. Both surrendering and confessing, it suggests that, hey, this person's trying to change, right? Less likely to commit another crime.
It's like they're proving to the court that they get it, their actions were serious, and they want to make amends.
You got it. Now, switching gears a bit, think about physical disabilities. Could those play a role in these mitigating circumstances?
It makes sense that having a physical disability might make you more vulnerable, right?
Mhm.
Or maybe it limits what you can even do in the first place.
You're absolutely right. If someone's disability, whether it's physical or affects their ability to act or defend themselves or even communicate, it can be considered during sentencing. It's about recognizing that we don't all have the same abilities, right? Justice needs to be tailored to each person's situation. Like someone who's deaf or blind or has a serious physical impairment might be treated differently than someone without those disabilities. It depends on the crime, of course.
So it's like, hey, we're not going to hold you to the same standard as someone who's fully able-bodied. That wouldn't be fair.
Exactly. It's about creating a level playing field, making sure justice is truly fair. Okay, now let's get into a trickier topic. Mental illness. We talked about insanity as a get-out-of-jail-free card, essentially. But what about situations where mental illness is a factor but not a total defense?
So it's not that they didn't know what they were doing. It's more like their mental state affected their choices.
Exactly. Imagine someone struggling with a mental illness that, it doesn't make them legally insane, but it seriously impacts their judgment, their willpower. Their actions might be because of their condition, so they're not as guilty as someone without those challenges.
It's a fine line, right? Figuring out how much their mental illness played a role without saying it's okay what they did.
Absolutely. It requires a careful look at their mental state, what crime they committed, and everything that was happening at the time.
Yeah, it reminds us that justice isn't always black and white. There's a lot of gray areas to consider. What about situations that don't fit neatly into these categories we've talked about? Those unique circumstances that might make someone deserve some leniency, even if they don't tick all the boxes for those traditional mitigating factors.
Ah, you're talking about analogous mitigating circumstances. It's like the catch-all category.
Ooh, I love a good legal wild card. What are some examples of that?
Well, one that comes up a lot is extreme poverty. Imagine someone steals food because they're desperate to feed their family. Stealing is wrong, of course, but the reasons behind it, the desperation, the lack of any evil intent, that might lead to a lighter sentence. It's understanding how their situation, their poverty, might have driven them to do it.
It's like saying, hey, we get it. You were in a desperate situation. We're going to consider that.
Exactly. And another example, one that really shows the power of remorse, it's called voluntary restitution. Imagine someone stole something, but then they give it back before anyone catches them. It might be because they were scared of getting caught,
Yeah.
but it can also be seen as genuine remorse, right? Trying to fix what they did, and that can lead to a lighter sentence, too.
I messed up, but I'm trying to make it right.
Exactly. It's those little signs of good intentions, trying to make amends, that can sometimes make all the difference.
Wow. Mitigating circumstances really add that human element to the law, don't they? It's like acknowledging that there's always more to the story than just the crime itself. Okay, so we've seen the good side. Now let's flip the coin. Talk about those aggravating circumstances, the things that make a crime even worse and can lead to harsher punishments. What makes a judge go, oh no, you really messed up this time?
All right, buckle up, because some of these are pretty intense. We already touched on a few, like dwelling, abuse of superior strength, and treachery. But trust me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. One that always gets people's attention is taking advantage of public office. It's like, you have this position of power, you have a special responsibility, but then you use it to help yourself commit crimes that betray the public's trust. The consequences are going to be way worse.
We trusted you with power and you used it to line your own pockets. Not cool.
Exactly. It's breaking that trust. It's worse than a regular crime, and the punishment reflects that. Now, think about the people who uphold the law, who keep our society safe. What happens when they become victims?
I'm guessing those crimes are treated more seriously, right? Attacking a cop or a judge, it's like a direct challenge to their authority.
You got it. There's this aggravating circumstance specifically for that. In contempt of or with insult to public authorities. It's recognizing how vital these people are. They keep the law working, keep society just. It's not just about the crime, it's disrespecting them and everything they represent.
So even something that seems minor, like resisting arrest or yelling at a cop, could be worse because of who they did it to.
Exactly. It's about maintaining order and respecting those who are there to uphold the law.
It makes you think about those videos you see online, people going crazy on flight attendants or retail workers. It's not just bad manners, it's disrespecting the authority they have in that situation.
Okay, now think about places like churches, the presidential palace, even disaster zones. These are places that, demand respect, they might be vulnerable or even sacred. You think crimes in those places would be viewed differently?
Yeah, I'd say so. Those are places where people should feel safe, protected. It seems like messing with that would be a big deal.
Absolutely right. Philippine law actually has a specific aggravating circumstance for that. They recognize that crimes in those places have a bigger impact. Places that have special meaning or where people are especially vulnerable, like after a natural disaster. It's like there's some lines you just don't cross.
So it's respecting those boundaries, acknowledging the extra harm caused by violating those shared spaces. We talked about cruelty before, but just how bad does it have to be to qualify for that?
Oh, it's not just a push or a mean word, Cruelty, legally speaking, it means deliberately causing pain and suffering, going way beyond what's needed for the crime. It's like they enjoyed causing pain, that sadistic element.
So it's the difference between robbing someone and torturing them while you do it.
Exactly. It's that extra evil intention, wanting to make them suffer. That's what makes cruelty such a serious, aggravating factor.
Chilling, but I guess it's good that the law recognizes and punishes that level of, well, evil.
We discussed reiteration before. That's about being a habitual criminal. But that's not the only way someone's past can come back to bite them in court.
Oh, I bet you're going to talk about recidivism next. Those repeat offenders.
You read my mind. Recidivism is all about committing the same type of crime again. So let's say someone gets convicted of theft, serves their time, then they steal again. That first conviction, it can be used against them, might make their sentence for the second crime even worse.
Didn't learn your lesson the first time. Okay, well, make sure you learned it this time.
Exactly. They're recognizing a pattern, This person keeps doing the same crime, so they're a bigger risk to society. And speaking of repeat offenders, there's an even trickier concept: quasi-recidivism.
Okay, quasi-recidivism, that sounds like a mouthful straight out of law school. Can you break that down for me?
All right, picture this. Someone's in prison, serving time for a crime, and while they're there, behind bars, they commit another crime.
Whoa, bold move. Racking up charges while you're already locked up?
Exactly. Quasi-recidivism is about recognizing how messed up that is. They commit a new crime while still being punished for the old one. It's a serious offense, can make their sentence a lot longer.
Prison wasn't enough of a deterrent. All right, how about an extended stay?
Now let's talk about those folks who just can't seem to stay out of trouble. Habitual delinquents.
So they're like the frequent flyers of the criminal justice system.
Exactly. Habitual delinquency is a label for those who just keep committing crimes, particularly certain types of crimes. They're the ones who just can't seem to stay on the right side of the law.
So it's not just one or two mistakes, it's a pattern of behavior.
Right. To be labeled a habitual delinquent, they need at least 3 convictions within a certain time frame. And those convictions have to be for specific crimes like theft, robbery, serious physical injury, fraud, things like that. It's a serious designation, and it can add more penalties on top of their current sentence.
So it's the system saying, look, you've had plenty of chances, you haven't learned, now we have to get seriouses.
You got it. It's about recognizing the risk they pose and the need for stricter measures to protect society.
Make you think of those crime shows, where they pull up a suspect's record and it's pages long.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now let's move on to crimes that involve a bit more planning and, well, let's just say professional courtesy.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of crimes are we talking about?
Imagine those situations where someone pays for criminal services. Hitmen, organized crime, I'll give you money to make this problem go away.
Ooh, that's getting dark. It's like turning crime into a business deal.
Exactly. And the law knows that those crimes are worse. There's more guilt involved. They have a specific aggravating circumstance for that in consideration of a price, reward, or promise.
It's like you didn't just do something bad in a moment of passion. You planned this and profited from it. That's way worse.
You got it. Now think about crimes that use technology to their advantage. Fast cars, speedboats, even planes, anything that makes the crime more dangerous, more sophisticated.
It's like something out of a James Bond movie. The getaway car is as iconic as the crime itself.
You got it. Philippine law gets that those methods are riskier. They're mobile, high-tech. There's an aggravating circumstance for that, too. By means of motor vehicles, motorized watercraft, airships, or other similar means.
So it's like you didn't just break the law, you used technology to make it more daring, more potentially harmful.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about technology in today's world. That's why they have this aggravating circumstance by, through, and with the use of information and communications technologies, or ICT for short. This covers all those cybercrimes, the hacking, identity theft, online fraud, all that.
It's like saying just because you're doing it behind a keyboard doesn't mean it's not real or doesn't cause real harm.
Exactly. And finally, there's one more aggravating circumstance that's particularly relevant in the Philippines, given their issues with drugs in crime. It's the qualifying aggravating circumstance of the use of dangerous drugs. This one recognizes how serious drug use is, for society as a whole, and how it often leads to more crime.
So if someone's high when they commit a crime, they're not just in trouble for the crime itself. They might get a worse sentence because of the drugs.
Exactly. It shows how dangerous drugs are and that we need to deal with this problem, both as a health issue and a criminal justice issue.
We've covered a lot, huh? All the ways a crime can be seen as more or less serious by the law. But before we wrap up this section, what about those times when the lines are blurry? The factors that could be either good or bad, depending on the crime and the situation.
Ah, you're talking about those alternative circumstances, right? The legal chameleons, they can go either way.
I love it. Tell me more about these legal shapeshifters.
Okay, well, we already talked about relationship. How family ties can sometimes help you out, like in property crimes, but can make things worse in crimes against people. But did you know even intoxication can go both ways?
Seriously. So saying you were drunk or high can sometimes be good for you, sometimes bad. How does that make sense?
Think of it this way. Someone's so drunk they're basically blacked out, right? And they do something they'd never do sober. That level of impairment, it might be a mitigating factor. Because their judgment was gone, they weren't really in control.
So it's like, okay, we get it. You were in a different state of mind. You weren't thinking straight.
Right. But here's the catch. If they got drunk on purpose, or if it was a habit and they knew they might do something stupid, Then it becomes an aggravating circumstance. It means they made a choice to get messed up, knowing the risks.
So you can't blame the booze if you deliberately downed a whole bottle of whiskey and then got behind the wheel.
Exactly. You're responsible for your choices, even if drugs or alcohol influence them.
Reminds me of those ads against drunk driving. It's not just illegal, it's potentially deadly for you and everyone else.
All right, now here's another alternative circumstance that might surprise you. It's the person's level of education.
Hold on, what? How can that be relevant to a crime?
It's not about being smart or dumb. It's about realizing that not everyone has the same opportunities. And sometimes a lack of education or guidance can lead to bad choices, especially in less serious crimes. Like if someone does something wrong because they just didn't know any better, not because they were being malicious, the court might consider that when deciding their sentence.
So it's like, we get it, you might not have known better.
Exactly. But, and this is important, it's not a blanket excuse. The court looks at the specifics of the crime and how their lack of education really played a role. It has to be relevant.
So a lawyer can't claim they didn't know something was illegal and expect to get away with it, right?
You got it. And here's the twist. With some really serious crimes, like treason, murder, crimes against chastity, a low level of education can actually be an aggravating circumstance because, even without a fancy education, there are some basic things you just know are wrong. These are fundamental moral boundaries.
It's like, okay, you might not have gone to the best schools, but you still know you shouldn't kill someone.
Right. There are some actions that everyone knows are wrong no matter what. Ignorance isn't a good enough excuse in those cases.
It's amazing how much depth there is to these legal ideas. I can see why lawyers have to study for years.
It's fascinating, that's for sure. And you know what's really cool? How Philippine criminal law tries to balance justice with understanding human behavior. It's not just blindly following rules. It's about seeing the whole picture. The motivations, the things that make the crime better or worse, all those factors matter.
So it's about seeing the whole story, not just the moment of the crime, right? Understanding the human behind the headlines.
Exactly. And I think that brings us to a really important concept. Those rare situations where even though a crime happened, the person isn't held responsible. We call these absolutory causes.
Absolutory causes. Okay, that sounds interesting. What are those all about?
It's like the law saying, okay, we get it. There are exceptions to every rule.
What kind of legal magic makes that possible?
One example is something called instigation. It's when law enforcement, basically, they trick someone into committing a crime they wouldn't have done otherwise.
So like those undercover stings you see on TV, where the cops set someone up to catch them red-handed.
Yeah, kind of. But instigation is more than just giving someone a chance to commit a crime. It's actively pushing them to do something they wouldn't have even thought of. It's controversial because is that really fair?
So if the cops practically put the idea in someone's head and then arrest them for it, that doesn't sound right.
Exactly. Another absolutory cause is exempting certain people who help someone else escape punishment. This usually applies to family members, helping a relative avoid consequences.
So like if my brother robs a bank and I help him hide the money, I might get a pass because we're family.
There are limits, of course. It only applies to specific crimes and only if you didn't participate in the crime itself or get any benefit from it. It's a very narrow exemption, but it shows how tough it can be, choosing between loyalty to your family and obeying the law.
A legal tug of war, huh? Family versus the law.
Speaking of tug of war, let's talk about multiple offenses. That's the idea that one action can sometimes lead to multiple charges. Or the opposite, where several actions might actually be one offense.
Hold up, my brain's already spinning. How can one act be multiple offenses or multiple acts be one offense?
That's what makes criminal law so interesting. It's not always simple. You have to think about the consequences of actions, how events are connected, and what the person intended to do.
Okay, hit me with those mind-bending scenarios.
Let's start with a classic, robbery with homicide. So imagine a robbery, but it goes wrong and the robber ends up killing someone. That's tragic, but it's not seen as two separate crimes.
So you're not charging them with robbery and homicide separately. It's recognizing that those two things are connected.
Exactly. In that case, the robbery and the killing are so tied together that they're considered one offense, a complex crime. The violence is so essential to the robbery that you can't separate them. It's like the killing wasn't something extra, it was part of the robbery itself.
So it's not giving the criminal a break, it's about putting that crime in the right legal category.
Exactly. Now, to be a complex crime, the two offenses have to be connected. Like one has to be necessary for the other. So with robbery with homicide, the killing might be to get rid of witnesses or to stop someone from fighting back or even just to escape. It's not just a coincidence. Those two crimes are linked.
It's like a puzzle, figuring out how all the pieces fit together to understand what really happened.
You're getting it.
Huh.
Now, here's something that sounds like a loophole, but it's a real legal principle. It's called error in personae. This is when you try to hurt one person, but you end up hurting someone else by mistake. Like mistaken identity, but with serious consequences.
Okay, this is getting interesting. So if I try to, I don't know, throw a pie in my enemy's face, but I accidentally hit someone else, that's error in personae.
You got the idea. But instead of pies, we're talking about actions that can change people's lives forever. The point is, they were aiming for someone specific, but because of a mistake or confusion, they hurt the wrong person.
So they're not off the hook completely, but it does change things, knowing that they didn't mean to hurt that specific person.
Exactly. They're still responsible, but it adds a whole new layer to the case.
It makes you think about those cases where someone hires a hitman, but the hitman kills the wrong person, you know,
Tragic.
and super complicated.
Now, what if someone wants to commit one crime, but they accidentally end up committing a totally different crime?
Okay, my head's already spinning. Give me an example.
Imagine someone tries to steal a car, but while they're escaping, they accidentally run someone over. They wanted to steal, but they ended up hurting or even killing someone.
Wow. Talk about unintended consequences. What do you call that?
It's called aberratio ictus, which basically means the blow went astray. It's when the person you wanted to hurt and the person who actually got hurt are different, often with tragic and unexpected results.
So would they be charged with both crimes, the stealing and the hurting?
Mm-hmm.
Or would it be one more serious charge?
That's where the law gets really complex. There's no easy answer. It depends. The courts have to look at everything. What happened, what the person meant to do, how bad the unintended result was, to decide the right charges and punishment.
So you have to see the whole picture, not just the individual parts, to really get it.
Exactly. And that's what makes criminal law so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about understanding the little details, the gray areas, and the human stories behind each case. Are you ready for even more legal adventures? Because we've only just scratched the surface of these alternative circumstances.
All right, my brain is still trying to process all that about multiple offenses.
Yeah.
It's crazy how one action can have so many illegal consequences,
Mm.
or how several actions can be seen as one crime. Legal gymnastics, for sure.
It really shows how Philippine criminal law tries to capture how complex human behavior is and how unpredictable the consequences of our actions can be. It's not just about following the rules, it's about understanding the why, the intent, and all the factors that make each case unique.
Now, about those alternative circumstances,
Yeah.
the ones that can be good or bad depending on the situation, what other examples are there?
Well, we talked about relationship, how family ties can be a mitigating factor, like in property crimes, but not in crimes against people. But did you know that intoxication can also go both ways?
Really? So being drunk or high can sometimes help you, sometimes hurt you. I don't get it.
Okay, imagine someone is so drunk they're blacked out, right? And they commit a crime they wouldn't have done sober. That extreme level of intoxication might be a mitigating factor because their judgment was gone, they weren't in control.
So it's like saying, we understand you were in a different state of mind, not thinking clearly.
Right. But there's a catch. If they got drunk on purpose, or if it was a habit and they knew they might do something wrong, then it's actually an aggravating circumstance. It means they chose to impair their judgment, knowing the risks.
So you can't blame the booze if you chugged a bottle of whiskey and then got behind the wheel.
Exactly. You're responsible for your choices, even if you were under the influence.
Those drug driving ads come to mind. It's not just illegal, it can be deadly.
Now, here's another interesting one. The person's education.
Wait, what? How can education be a factor in a crime?
It's not about intelligence. It's about understanding that not everyone has the same opportunities. Sometimes a lack of education or guidance can lead to bad choices, especially with less serious crimes. So if someone does something wrong because they just didn't know better, not out of malice, the court might consider that when sentencing them.
We understand you might not have known any better.
Right, but it's not a free pass, of course. The court will look closely at the crime and how their lack of education played a role. It has to be relevant.
So a lawyer can't say, oops, I didn't know that was illegal,
Yeah.
and expect to get away with it.
Exactly. And here's the twist. For some very serious crimes like treason, murder, crimes against chastity, having a low level of education can actually be an aggravating circumstance. Because there are some basic morals that everyone should understand no matter their education.
It's like, okay, you might not have gone to the best schools, but you still know you shouldn't kill someone.
Right. Some actions are universally wrong. Ignorance isn't an excuse for those.
Wow, there's so much to consider with these legal concepts.
It is fascinating, and what's really interesting is how Philippine criminal law tries to balance justice with an understanding of human behavior. It's not just blindly applying rules, it's about looking at the context, the motivations, the things that make the crime better or worse.
So it's about seeing the whole picture, not just the crime itself, right? It's about understanding the human story behind it all.
Well said. I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into criminal law in the Philippines.
Wow, what a journey. We talked about legal jargon, exemptions, mitigating and aggravating circumstances, multiple offenses, even those absolutory causes that can completely clear someone. I've learned so much, it's been eye-opening and a bit humbling to realize how much I didn't know.
Yeah, it shows us that there's always more to learn, and that even the most complicated legal ideas are about people, ultimately.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this legal adventure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Philippine criminal law. Until next time, remember, justice is a journey, not a destination. And the most fascinating discoveries are often found in those unexpected twists and turns.